Friends, this is a difficult passage. It's such a difficult text. Loving our enemies is one of the hardest things that Jesus asks of us. And it's so easy to get this wrong. And it's so hard to get this right. Love your enemies. It's a difficult text, and it's a difficult text to preach, mainly because I am not Sarah Fisher. If Sarah was preaching, she would have some brilliant sermon on how we are to love our neighbor and our enemy, but you're stuck with me. And last time I preached, I had this nice handout, right? Thing. You may have walked out of here with a little bit more clarity. I make no promises to you today. What I have to offer you is how, as one of your priests, I wrestle with the commandment. It's commanded of us. Not just if we feel like it, not if we're having a good day. The commandment to love your enemy. So what I have here are just my random scattered thoughts, and we'll see if God can even use those. But this text is hard, if we're honest, because it feels unnatural. It feels wrong, even. How can we love those who do us harm? Shouldn't justice demand something? If you had asked me a few years ago to name my enemies, I might have struggled to give you an answer. But not today. I have lists. Do you have lists of enemies? Names? Some of them might be scratched off. This text is hard because the first step is to acknowledge that you do have enemies. The whole commandment is precedented upon the fact that you have enemies. And whether we admit it or not, there are people that we struggle to wish well. And there are people that we would rather perhaps weed out than see flourish. And Jesus commands us to love our enemy. Now, to understand this, you have to understand the logic of this passage, how it is working. Okay? And this is how the passage works. We love our enemies. We love those who feel estranged and foreign to us because God loved us when we were estranged and when we were foreign to God. Do you see the logic of the passage there? Yay, nay? Yay, okay.
Doesn't make it easier.
Doesn't make it easier. But you see the turning point. That is the logic of the command. You be merciful just as your Father is merciful. This is imitatio Dei, the call to imitate God. God's initiative, this is how it works. God's initiative, God first loving us, that initiative creates, friends, the possibility and the power for us to do the same. That until you have an experience of God's love, until you have an experience of you yourself needing mercy and receiving mercy, if you do not have that first, the call to extend mercy will be an impossibility. That's the logic of the text. Those aren't Trey's words. Don't throw your shoes at me. Without the experience of God's love, that command feels weak, it feels powerless, it feels like an impossibility. And so this is why Jesus begins not with enemy love, but with divine mercy. And so, friends, for some of us, what this looks like, we're coming up on Lent. For some of us, what this looks like is acknowledging our own sin. Acknowledging our own sinfulness. This is how this sermon is going to go, friends. Okay? I'm going to say some things, and then I'm going to look at your blank stares, and then I'm going to say, but there's this other thing we need to consider too. So yes, but you see, this is what I'm going to do. So I'm just going to, you're on a roller coaster. You don't know where this is going, okay? We acknowledge our own sinfulness, but this is not to dull our critiques of injustice around us. Yes. You following that? Okay? We begin and acknowledge our own sinfulness, not to dull our critiques of injustice or to silence the truth about wrongdoing, but it is from our own experience in that we can speak to the other experiences. Okay? You receive what then you can give. Okay? Work with me here. We begin with mercy because without it we cannot love rightly. Without it, we will distort this commandment time and time again. And so what does loving your enemy look like? Jesus gives us a couple of examples. How many of us have heard the turning the other cheek, giving them your cloak and your tunic? But people ask, we've heard these before. How many of us have heard the interpretation that these are actually acts of resistance? Have we heard these interpretations? Fabulous. Okay. Here we go. Jesus tells us to turn the other cheek. Not because we accept injustice, but because we refuse to let hatred define us. Mercy has already defined us. God's beloved has already defined us. God's image bearer has already defined us. And we will not let any other title define us or our enemy. So how this worked in Jesus' day, you would backhand somebody. You would slap someone using the back of your hand to insult them and to belittle them. It was this very public display of belittling someone. So imagine someone just backhanded you, they're belittling you, they're calling into question your own dignity. When you turn the other cheek to them, you then offer that person the chance to slap you with their palm. Now, you might be saying, why would you do that? To slap someone with an open hand or a palm is to show you are on equal footing to them, that you will not be belittled by them. You see the image? Can you imagine this? Sarah, no, I'm just kidding.
Show him. I've done this before.
So, backhand, Sarah.
He's not going to really hurt me. Oh, sorry. I might hurt him while I step on his foot.
Sarah, I'm publicly humiliating you. Okay. And then she would turn the other cheek. You see this gesture, what it's communicating? Saying to me, if you're going to do that again, do it with your open your open hand and look me in the eye. Basically. Okay, thank you, Sarah. That's good. It's a gesture of equal status. Okay? Y'all following so far? It's not submission, it's dignified resistance. There's a difference. Jesus gives us this provocative attitude that responds and unmasks the aggression for what it is. That's what he's giving his disciples. And so when we refuse to retaliate, when we expose the world's cycle of violence, we break it. Not by returning hate for hate, but by offering something the enemy doesn't expect. Similar thing with the coat, okay? Back in the day, you could sue someone for their possessions, and you were allowed to take, so you had inner garments and then you had outer garments. Underwear, outerwear, okay? You could sue someone for their undergarments, but you couldn't take their outer garments. Why? Because it was an act of mercy. when nights get freezing and frigid, everyone deserves an outer coat. You cannot take that from them. So what does Jesus say? Well, he's imagining a thief or someone coming up, strips you of your outer garment, and then what does he tell his disciples to do? Give them the inner garments as well. And then what does that leave you with? Nothing. You're naked, as I grew up hearing. And your nakedness exposes the violence against you. Y'all following so far? You see how these totally flip how we interpret what this passage is doing. Totally flip it. It's still hard. Loving your enemy is still hard. And it's hard because it's risky. To love your enemy is to act on their behalf right now, and it's to act on the future of our enemy. That is, it is a refusal to eradicate the enemy here and now, which is a temptation, and instead to extend their existence into the future. Why? The risk and hope that the enemy will be granted the opportunity and the ability to step out of their enmity. A refusal to define the enemy by our own standards of justice and entrust God's movement. Christ calls us to see even our enemies as recipients of God's mercy. And we have already seen loving them does not mean passivity. It means refusing to let hatred or inferiority define us and to define them. Refusing to let our persecutor continue in their lostness unchecked. To refuse to let them to do harm against the image of God that resides in you and in themselves. It is the creative intervention within our systems of violence that halt the prosecutor from further harm. Y'all with me? I feel like I'm just saying words at you. Are y'all following? This text is hard because I already have the question in my head, but what about justice? What about those for whom turning the cheek is not an option because no one is watching? This whole ethic of turn the other cheek, of give them the inner and outer tunic, it all revolves around assuming there is a public around you that is aware and that can discern when injustice is taking place. So what happens for those who cannot turn the cheek because no one is watching? What about those whom have no cloak to give? Are you following me? Friends, it is not an end-all, be-all answer, but it is a place to start. And how do we reconcile this Christian ethic with our understanding of justice? Justice, we might say, occurs when all of our neighbors not only see themselves truthfully, which is to see themselves as bearing the image of God, of seeing themselves as recipients of grace, but also to have the means by which they can generously love their enemy. Does that make sense? What would a society look like when everyone has the provisions and means by which they can actually do the radical work of loving their enemy? That reframes the whole conversation. If you still find it impossible to love your enemy like I do on most days, start here. Start with the abundance and the mercy of God. Jesus gives us an image in the final part of our gospel, a good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put into your lap. Picture a full measure of grain, packed tightly and overflowing. This is what God's mercy is like, Jesus tells us. Abundant, spilling over. And friends, the more that we can be anchored to that, the more that you can be anchored to abundance in these seasons where enemy making is so easy to do. The more you can be tied to that anchor, to that abundance, the more we receive it, the more it will make this commandment a possibility. It is through abundance and mercy that we gain the bold courage to resist any definition of ourselves or others that falls short of God's mercy. Be merciful as your God in heaven is merciful. Amen.